Hi, boys and girls. So, after we reviewed what life was like for a slave in New York State prior to the immigration process, today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the Civil War. Okay? So, the Civil War is a famous event in the history of our country, and it ran from about 1861 to 1865. And we're going to talk about the causes of the war, the leading players. We're going to talk about the role of New York State in the Civil War, and then the outcome. So first, let's talk about a nation divided. So Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, as many of you know, was elected president in 1860. And his wish to end slavery was very well known. Up to that point, slavery existed in every state in our country. And although some people have the misconception that northern states did not have slaves, that's not true. There were slaves in northern states, including New York State. However, before 1860, people started to kind of push slavery away. People felt it was wrong. It was not right to enslave somebody. You couldn't actually own a person. So I think that it's important to realize that not was slavery illegal already, or not that it didn't exist in northern states. It's just that people in the northern states began to adopt more liberal views towards slavery at an earlier time. So African American people were living in New York State amongst their white counterparts, and they were developing businesses and newspapers and factories. Some African Americans were free citizens, but some were still enslaved as well. And in the southern states, where slavery was much more accepted, widely accepted, they didn't want things to change. They wanted things to stay the way they were. And they felt as though northern states were having much more pull in terms of passing laws and policies. And they didn't want the northern states passing laws and policies that they didn't agree with. So what they decided to do was they decided to come together and secede from the Union. Secede means to break away from. And the Union, when I mention the Union is the United States of America, okay? And it's a popular term that was used back then to describe the entire country, the Union of States, okay? So these southern states decided to secede from the Union and form their own country, otherwise known as the Confederate States of America, or a shorter name was the Confederacy. So the President Lincoln at this point, and the northern states wanted the Union to remain intact. Intact means together. And they felt as though it was worth putting in the effort for the Union to remain intact, and therefore a civil war began. The definition of any civil war is when the people of the same country fight against one another. It is uncommon. More common are wars where one country fights against another. But a civil war, which can be terribly detrimental to the longevity and the life of a country, is when the people of the same country fight against one another due to a difference of opinion. So if you think of the country as a national battleground, the Battle of Sumter was in South Carolina, and it was actually the first battle of the Civil War. And a lot of people don't realize this, is that hundreds of thousands of lives were lost during the Civil War. And it was in excess of 600,000, but some studies today say it actually could have been many more. But the number stands between 600,000 and 700,000. And in fact, that is more than the combined total of World War I, II, and the Vietnam War altogether. So more people died in the Civil War than died in 3 other wars combined. The famous Battle of Gettysburg, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, was a turning point in the war. And it's also where the Union set the stage for their overall victory of the Civil War. President Lincoln, a lot of us know him for his many accomplishments, but abolishing slavery was by far his biggest accomplishment. Of course, he was successful in other ways as president, as leader of the country, but abolishing slavery was something that was very close to him and dear to him and important to him. And he was a leading abolitionist prior to being elected. An abolitionist was someone who wanted to abolish slavery. Okay, so he was a leading abolitionist before he even became president. So he was known for those policies, which, as he was running for president, and therefore when he was elected, fear spread among those southern states who did not want to abolish slavery. He was elected in 1860, and as I said, the southern states were opposed to his policies and his laws, and they immediately reacted to his inception to office and started seceding from the Union, as I said earlier. And on January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued what is known as the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the states in the Confederates, all the slaves in the Confederate States. He emancipated them. To be emancipated means to be freed or to be made independent or put out on your own. And Lincoln's proclamation would end up leading to the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, which would happen several years later, and which permanently abolished slavery across the entire United States, making it illegal. Unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated, most people know, at the Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, and many people believe that it was the tireless work that he did to abolish slavery that ended up costing him his life. So now let's turn our thoughts to New York State's role during the Civil War, okay? So New York State at the time was the most populous of the states in the US, and for that reason, because the most people lived here, New York was undoubtedly the biggest contributor of men, of bodies to the war effort. Almost 500,000 or 500,000 of the men who fought and unfortunately may have died during the Civil War actually came from New York State. The northern regions the northern regions of New York supported the effort to keep the Union intact, but strangely, the lower city region around New York City worried that the economy wouldn't recover and that freeing slaves would actually take jobs away from middle-class white workers. So higher class citizens supported the effort, but it was the middle class who really worried that the economic instability of the war and then freeing slaves who would then create competition for middle class jobs could be detrimental overall to the country and to the economy of New York City specifically. New York City, and as we've learned, was a trade hub because of the water access to New York City. It was a trade hub, and cotton, which was mainly harvested by African-American slaves in southern states, was heavily exported through the ports of New York City. Therefore, New York City's economy relied very heavily on the cotton industry, which was based in the South and really was fueled by the work that was done by African-American slaves. And for that reason, there were really deep ties between New York City merchants and those white owners of cotton plantations who owned the African-American slaves who would do the harvesting of the cotton. So there were a lot of conflicts of interest happening. And therefore, not only was the country divided, but in New York State itself was a divided, very complexly divided place. So I want us to watch this video, and it's going to tell us a little bit more about the role of New York State in the Civil War. And I want you to watch very closely. It's a really good one, and I think that you, sorry. Okay, so eventually the Civil War ended officially on April 9th, 1865, when General Lee surrendered to the Union. And as you can imagine, after 4 or 5 long years of civil unrest, the country was deeply fractured. But President Lincoln believed strongly that the Union would not only heal, but actually come out on the other side stronger for having been through this horrible experience. Slavery was officially abolished when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And several years later, in fact, the 13th Amendment, which you can see here, outlined the complete abolition of slavery across the country, making it illegal. And Lincoln sought to generously help the southern states to heal and rebuild. He wanted them to be welcomed back into the country. But unfortunately, just 70 days after General Lee surrendered and the Civil War officially ended, President Lincoln was assassinated, and he did not live to see the rebuilding or the reconstruction of our country. So it's important to remember that slavery existed in our state and in our country not so long ago, not much longer prior to the immigration period that we just finished studying. And the reason it's important for us to remember that it wasn't so long off is because we have to learn from history and make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. And clearly, I think we can all agree that slavery is one of those things that should have never happened in the first place and can never happen.